Richmond Hill, Georgia is today a bustling little community of just over 10,000 people. It's a place of natural beauty, easy coastal living, and family fun. Each day, thousands of drivers make their way past the main intersection of Highways 17 and 144 without a clue as to the rich historical treasures they pass along the way.
Most people in Richmond Hill are really unaware of the rich historical area that we live in.
People, as a large rule, really don't have time to think about history.
But just beyond the busy roadways lies a truly fascinating story. A tale told by ancient people, European explorers, colonial settlers, Civil War soldiers, great plantation owners, enslaved and freed African Americans, and a 20th century industrial giant.
There's more here than just a four-way intersection, you know, beautiful rivers and that kind of thing. People lived here for hundreds of years.
Sometimes you have to just look behind the main road, get off the highway to find the history. It's here, it's just not always very obvious.
If you do take time to leave the main road, you'll find Richmond Hill offers a true historical adventure, just waiting to be discovered by you. Perhaps the hidden history of Richmond Hill can best be told starting with some of the first people to call the area home.
There were Wally Indians in this region, and the Wally had a presence in what is now Lower Bryan County. There are evidence of burial mounds and ceremonial mounds attesting to the Wally presence, probably about 4,500 years BP before the present.
The Wale were actually the Aboriginal people of the Georgia coast, from the Altamaha River all the way to the Savannah River.
Archaeologist Ryan Sipe, a former graduate student at Georgia Southern University, did research on the Wale Indians and in 2012 conducted an extensive archaeological dig at the site of a Wale village near Kilkenny, east of Richmond Hill.
This is one of 5 of what I call these village cores that we found on Bryan Neck, and this would have served this basically the whole southeastern tip of Bryan Neck as sort of the chiefly administrative center.
The team discovered numerous large mounds of oyster shells the Native Americans left behind, as well as fragments of distinctive Wale pottery and other artifacts.
This is one of the best indications of the type of occupation that we've discovered here, and this is essentially a pile of garbage. This is a pile of Wale garbage. What this provides us is a sample of their daily life.
The exact location of the Wale village is kept secret in order to protect the site and its artifacts. But there is a place where the public can learn about the Wale of Bryan Neck, get up close to artifacts, and see the location of another Wale village.
Well, if visitors want to learn about Richmond Hill's earliest residents, they can visit Fort McAllister State Historic Park. Their museum has a lot of information on the Wale Indians, as well as artifacts such as pottery with the inlaid press designs. When visitors leave the museum, they will find a historical marker located on the banks of the Ogeechee River, which gives more information on the Wale Indians and points to the site of the former village located on what's now known as 7 Mile Bend, which is a hairpin turn in the Ogeechee River.
In 1562, French explorer Jean Ribault sailed up the lower Ogeechee River, becoming the first European visitor to present-day coastal Bryan County. He was followed 4 years later by Spanish missionaries, who established a Catholic mission to Christianize the Wale Indians in the area. Researchers believe the mission was active here until the year 1666. One of the first English military outposts in the new Georgia colony was Fort Argyle, built on the Ogeechee River in 1733, Intended to protect Georgia from Indian attacks as well as Spanish and French incursions, Fort Argyle never saw combat. It remained in existence until the 1770s. There were a handful of settlers here in the early colonial days. Archaeologists have uncovered what they believe to be the remains of the homestead of George Cubbage, a soldier who served at Fort Argyle.
Well, when we did some of the initial background research of the area, we knew that the Cubbages were here, but we didn't actually plan on finding a house site. This was very much an accident when we first located it. We were actually doing initial surveys and shovel testing of the area when we actually stumbled across this pile of tabby rubble that you can kind of see over here. You can kind of see some of the tabby right here where it would have been holding up braces or brackets for the house potentially.
In the early days of Georgia, present-day coastal Bryan County was almost home to the colony's capital. In 1755, Governor John Reynolds planned the creation of a new town he named Hardwick, and decreed this would become the new seat of royal government. Plans called for 610 lots, as well as a church and a cemetery, to be spread over 500 acres on the southern end of 7 Mile Bend on the Ogeechee River. Reynolds believed the site's location near the coast was a better fit than Savannah, which was situated several miles inland on the Savannah River. The plans for Hardwick came to an end 4 short years later when Reynolds' successor, James Wright, decided to leave the capital in Savannah. Hardwick never became more than a small trading post, and today nothing remains. The next significant group of people to call Richmond Hill home were wealthy planters who built large plantations and amassed huge fortunes in the 18th and 19th centuries. These men included Richard Arnold, George Washington McAllister, and Thomas Savage Clay.
Rice was the major money crop in coastal Georgia and South Carolina throughout the antebellum plantation period. People do associate cotton as the major part of the southern economy. But in this region, from about Georgetown, South Carolina, south to the Georgia-Florida line, it was rice. And the Richmond Hill area rice plantations were some of the most profitable and productive anywhere in the southeast coastline.
Bryan and Chatham County per acre grew more rice than anywhere in the world or anywhere in the country.
Though the wealthy planters lived in relative luxury, the rice plantations were hard, back-breaking places for the slaves who made them profitable.
The work on the rice plantation was unending and in many ways miserable. If you can ever imagine standing knee-deep, waist-deep in water and shoveling mud, and just think about doing that day after day under the hot sun, it's just an incredible amount of work.
The enslaved people working on the plantations grew rice in a method known as the task system, which was very different than the gang method used on cotton plantations further inland, and which helped to alleviate the slave suffering to some degree.
It's a system of work that assigned acreages to numbers of workers with the expectation that at a given hour in the day when they completed their work, they would turn to matters of interest to themselves, their own gardens, their own families, their churches, and so forth.
You got much more personal autonomy within the task system. You have more opportunity to spend time working on something for your family, and it's really built as an incentive system.
Though rice growing predominated, cotton was cultivated in Lower Bryan County as well. It was long staple Sea Island cotton, a variety highly prized for its use in fine fabrics. Sea Island cotton required a great deal of effort to grow and could only be grown on high ground above the marshes. The most successful planter was Rhode Islander Richard James Arnold, who owned 5 plantations scattered over more than 11,000 acres on the Ogeechee River. Evidence of the rice planting period remains today in the form of geometric canals dug through the marsh by slaves. These man-made rivers were used to alternately flood and drain the rice fields. You can see some of the canals up close alongside the walking trails in Richmond Hill's J.F. Gregory Park. Another legacy of Bryan County's great planters is the handful of plantation mansions they left behind. George Washington McAllister's circa 1838 Strathy Hall and the circa 1845 cotton plantation home in Kilkenny. Perhaps most grand of all is the Folly Farms Mansion, formerly Myrtle Grove Plantation, which was built by Richard Arnold as a wedding gift for his daughter. His home was the adjacent Whitehall Plantation. Built in 1850, Myrtle Grove was restored in the 1920s and 30s and is today a private home. The final resting place of many of Bryan County's wealthy rice-planting families is Burnt Church Cemetery, located on Highway 144 east of Richmond Hill.
Burnt Church Cemetery is one of the most fascinating places if you're a history buff. You can walk through the historic part of the cemetery under the live oaks and visit the graves of several of the most prominent planters in the area.
The vast wealth of rice planters was wiped out in a flash in the mid-1860s by the outcome of the American Civil War. And that outcome was decided in no small part by a brutal battle fought in Bryan County in December of 1864 at a place called Fort McAllister. Constructed by slaves in the summer of 1861 on a spit of land known as Genesis Point, Fort McAllister was a simple earthen fortification. Fort McAllister was positioned to protect a key railroad junction, and its importance grew after other Confederate coastal fortifications were abandoned early in the war.
And when they abandoned the islands, the offshore islands, then Fort McAllister, or what was Genesis Point Battery at that time, suddenly was no longer a secondary position. It was on the front lines, and then that meant that it needed to be expanded and strengthened.
Soon the earthen fort faced the ferocity of the U.S. Navy's toughest kind of warship, the new ironclad Monitor. The Union fleet used Fort McAllister as a testing ground for the state-of-the-art warships on more than one occasion, even sending 3 monitors against the fort at one time on March 3, 1863. But the plucky little fort withstood every Union attack.
They bombarded the fort for over 8 hours. These 3 ironclads and 7 gunboats, and then brought up some mortar schooners and shelled them during the night with 13-inch mortars. The problem that they ran into was Fort McAllister is basically a dirt fort, sand. And that was part of what gave McAllister its resiliency, was the Northerners couldn't fire enough shells against the place to destroy it and drive the garrison out so they could pass the fort.
Each time that it was attacked by the ships, it was pretty much almost destroyed, and by the next morning it was rebuilt and brand new again, a little bit stronger.
When Fort McAllister fell to Union forces, it was not from an attack by the sea, but rather one from land. Union General William T. Sherman set out from Atlanta in November 1864 on a destructive march to the sea. Sherman's final goal was the city and port of Savannah, but first he needed to meet up with the Union Navy to resupply his troops. The only obstacle in Sherman's way was Fort McAllister. Sherman's troops began their attack on the afternoon of December 13th. With the Confederate defenders outnumbered 25-1, the outcome was never in doubt.
It only took 15 minutes for the assault to be completed. From the time they broke from the tree line to the time they were over the walls and in the fort was only 15 minutes.
Aside from Fort McAllister itself, another piece of hidden history remains from the Civil War. The wreckage of the commerce raider and blockade runner Rattlesnake, also known at various times as the Thomas L. Rag and the CSS Nashville, is hidden beneath the waters of the Ogeechee River near Fort McAllister.
The Nashville, before the war, was a side-wheel passenger and mail steamer that ran between Charleston and New York. It was in Charleston when the hostilities broke out, and it was seized and turned over to the Confederate Navy. So it became one of the first of the Confederate Navy's gunboats.
The Nashville was a big, fast ship, 216 feet long and 34 feet wide, able to race through the water at speeds up to 13 knots. Leaving Charleston, South Carolina, the newly commissioned Confederate warship soon proved its worth, sinking 2 Northern vessels on a round-trip voyage to England and arriving back in the Confederacy with a $3 million cargo that helped fund the Southern War effort. The U.S. Navy began a furious, frenzied search for the Nashville, aiming to stop its attacks on U.S. shipping and the embarrassment of its success. Leaving Beaufort, North Carolina, the Nashville, now transformed into a privately owned commerce raider and renamed the Thomas L. Ragg, was chased by this U.S. Navy warship, the Keystone State. Moving as fast as her crew could sail her, the Thomas L. Ragg slipped into the Ogeechee River and tucked in behind the protection of Fort McAllister's cannons. The U.S. Navy increased its blockading presence, essentially bottling up the ship, now with new owners and renamed Rattlesnake. The ship's captain made several unsuccessful attempts to slip out into the open ocean, but was stopped every time. On February 27, 1863, the Rattlesnake ran hard aground in the river, just beyond the protection of Fort McAllister's guns. The Union blockaders, now bolstered by the arrival of the ironclad monitor Montauk, began a furious attack on the fort and the Rattlesnake, firing round after round into the helpless Confederate ship until she caught fire and sank into the muddy river.
She burned for about 40 minutes, then her magazine blew up.
As the smoldering remains of the ill-fated Rattlesnake floated past the Montauk, one of the ironclad's crew wrote, "If we would not allow the Nashville to run the blockade as a whole, she was going to run the blockade in pieces." Though the bulk of the wreckage remains concealed beneath the murky waters of the Ogeechee, you may see large pieces of the ship's machinery on exhibit outside Fort McAllister. An exhibit inside the Fort Museum tells the ship's story and brings the plight of the Rattlesnake to light. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the freed slaves of Lower Bryan County put their own distinctive stamp on the area's history.
The emancipated slaves after the Civil War developed their own settlements throughout Lower Bryan County. They were either given land by their former owners or they purchased land and developed small-scale farming activities. And they became very industrious and developed their own agriculture.
After slavery, this area became one of the largest areas of black land ownership in the country. It really was their lifeblood. Everything that they had came from the land and their ability to draw life from it.
But equally central to the black community was the ability to create their own houses of worship, a powerfully symbolic act for those once forced to attend their masters' churches.
One of the first things that Bryan Neck African Americans did coming out of the end of the war was build their own church.
In 1869, the oldest African American church in Lower Bryan County was established as the Bryan Neck Missionary Baptist Church.
Within the church, communities had control over events in their lives.
A few years after the Civil War, Lower Bryan County was the scene of an ambitious social experiment carried out by a pair of unusual former slaves. William and Ellen Craft escaped slavery in Middle Georgia in 1848 with a remarkable ruse. Ellen, who is light-skinned, dressed as a young white man, with William posing as her servant. Together they escaped to Boston, then Canada and England. The Crafts wrote about their experience in the book Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, which was published in London in 1860. After the war ended, the Crafts returned to Georgia. In 1870, they purchased more than 1,700 acres of former cotton plantation land on Bryan Neck. Here, they established the Woodville Cooperative Farm School, which combined classical education with training in practical job skills.
They were successful in getting this idea started. Unfortunately, they weren't successful in carrying it forward.
Until a fabricated controversy caused funding to dwindle in 1875, up to 75 children of freed slaves were educated at the school. It's interesting to note that Richmond Hill wasn't always called by its present name. In the mid to late 1850s, when the Savannah, Albany, and Gulf Railroad was built through the area, it passed through land owned by a man named William Way. Each whistle-stop station along the route was named for the person who owned the surrounding land. Consequently, present-day Richmond Hill came to be known as Way's Station, a name it held until the early 20th century and the arrival of a man who changed the area forever.
Well, the present town of Richmond Hill is mostly identified with Henry Ford. You cannot get away from that fact. You drive into Richmond Hill from any direction and there will be signs, you know, a Henry Ford city.
The world-famous automobile innovator who created the assembly line manufacturing process and turned Detroit into a car-making powerhouse also trained his visionary gaze on the fields and forests of Lower Bryan County. Ford and his wife Clara came here in the 1920s looking for a southern winter getaway and found much more.
And it was Henry Ford who came to Lower Bryan County in 1925 and began to purchase property, lots of land on Lower Bryan County, owned upwards of 90,000 acres at the peak of his land ownership in the 1940s. And he came to Richmond Hill with the hopes of developing a rubber plantation to go along with his, of course, his Detroit Ford Motor Company.
The rubber trees never grew profitably among the South Georgia pines, but Ford had other tricks up his sleeve. Many tested out at a lab he built here in 1937. Experiments focused on creating industrial materials from agricultural products grown on Ford's lands. Ford and his friend George Washington Carver of the famed Tuskegee Institute were mutual admirers and collaborated on these projects in the late 1930s and early 40s. In addition to the lab, Ford established a large agricultural operation here, producing 8,400 crates of iceberg lettuce in a single season. And a sawmill converted trees from Ford's land into thousands of board feet of marketable lumber. But all of this activity served an unseen higher purpose.
Ford was also very interested in not just making cars, but making people. He wanted to see what he could make of the people in this region.
In other words, Henry Ford wanted to create the perfect American community here in Lower Bryan County. His goal was to turn out a bumper crop of well-educated, cultured, healthy, and productive Americans, and Richmond Hill was his laboratory for this grand social experiment. He created a city from scratch, complete with housing, schools, jobs, social activities, shopping, worship, and more. Entire neighborhoods rose up where nothing but pine trees stood before.
Henry Ford built housing developments for his employees, the first of which was the Bottom. It was officially known as Richmond Hill Village, but prior to construction and after construction, the locals called it the Bottom because it was built in a low-lying, swampy area, and Ford cleared it and drained it and built houses on it. The second neighborhood built was called Blueberry Village, and both of these neighborhoods consisted of 2- and 3-bedroom homes. They were free of charge to employees until the IRS decided that Ford had to charge rent, so he began charging $15 a month for these homes, but in turn raised their pay $15 per month.
In Ford's eyes, it was an instant utopia created in the South Georgia wilderness, and priority number one was education, creating a new future for Bryan County's young people, regardless of their race.
Ford was very interested in providing education for both the black and the white children in the area. The ideal student or coming out of the Ford schools and the programs down here would know a trade. If they were a boy, would have good housekeeping skills. If they were a girl, would know things like square dancing and social etiquette.
Henry Ford did develop a school, the George Washington Carver School for African American children, opened in 1938, and that provided the first sustained and comprehensive educational opportunity for the African American children of Lower Bryan County. Because prior to that, they had been going to school in the standard one-room schoolhouses of that era from the late early 1900s. And the G.W. Carver School was an important step in education for the African American children of Bryan County.
All his workers knew that one of his pet projects was the George Washington Carver School. He felt like he really wanted to give that community here a leg up and an opportunity to succeed.
Ford also succeeded in eradicating one of Bryan County's most persistent and insidious scourges, mosquito-borne malaria, which sickened a majority of the people who lived here and claimed many lives.
It affected really everybody because you just couldn't get away from the mosquitoes, you couldn't get away from its transmission. 100% of the people would be exposed to malaria. It was particularly difficult for the African American community.
Of course, the Fords made sure to build a comfortable home for themselves in Lower Bryan County as well. Using bricks from the early 19th century Hermitage plantation on the Savannah River, the couple created their southern dream home.
It's located on the banks of the Ogeechee River on Sterling Bluff. It has everything Clara wanted in a southern mansion. Tall white columns and sweeping views of the river. It's just beautiful from every angle.
Ford named the estate Richmond, taking a cue from Richmond on Ogeechee, Thomas Savage Clay's rice plantation that stood on the same spot until Union troops burned it in the Civil War. In fact, Ford's new Richmond house is where the city of Richmond Hill got its name.
And in 1941, the people of Wave Station applied for a post office to have a postal facility here, and they wanted to have the name changed to reflect Henry Ford. They wanted to name the town Fordtown or Fordville, and Henry Ford, being somewhat of a modest fellow, did not like that idea. He did not want a town named after him, so he suggested Richmond after his house. But Richmond Hill stuck, it became the name, and the post office came and the town was incorporated with the name of Richmond Hill in 1962.
It's been suggested that the word hill might have originated with Cherry Hill, another rice plantation adjacent to Richmond. However, evidence seems to indicate Ford simply added the word hill to the name as an afterthought. In any case, the name stuck, and we still call Henry Ford City Richmond Hill today. In all, Henry Ford built close to 300 structures in Richmond Hill. Many remain today. The Martha Mary Chapel is a Catholic church. The community house and the courthouse annex still stand in the center of town. Ford's kindergarten building now houses the Richmond Hill History Museum and its collection of artifacts and materials. The old commissary store is a church. And the bakery has housed several businesses. Ford also saved the remains of Fort McAllister and purchased and restored several of the area's 19th century plantation homes. But aside from buildings, perhaps the most pervasive reminders of Ford's impact on the area are the white wooden fences that stretch along roadsides throughout Lower Bryan County.
Henry and Clara Ford designed a very simple white fence. Those can still be seen today in front of a lot of historical buildings. But at one time they stretched for miles and miles. Just a very simple wooden fence, and what made it unique is that they would plant Cherokee roses on the fencing, which is Georgia's state flower.
From roses to churches, farms to homes, and schools to roads, Henry Ford left an indelible mark on Richmond Hill and made it the city it is today.
You can't take away from Ford the overall good that he did for a lot of people. It's perfectly right to call it the town that Henry Ford built.
Today, the Richmond Hill Historical Society has embarked on a 21st century campaign to tell the story of Richmond Hill's hidden history.
We've created a series of historical markers. They highlight 30+ sites in Richmond Hill. The idea behind the markers is to bring people closer to our history. We want people to be able to go to a site and envision what happened there before, to picture life on an Indian village, a rice plantation, think about the wealthy planters and the African slaves, envision Sherman's army marching through Bryan Neck on their way to Fort McAllister. And hearing the echo of Henry Ford's steam engine as he came to Way Station, Georgia each winter, and how he transformed one of the most impoverished towns in Georgia into one of the most thriving during the worst years of the Great Depression.
In addition to historical markers throughout the area, the Society has created a smartphone application that puts Richmond Hill's history literally in people's hands.
We're living in a technological society. People, they don't open a history book. They go online. Well, when they go online and get the historical marker apps and so forth, it's literally right there at their fingertips.
I hope that through the work we do here at the Historical Society and the museum, the Coastal Bryan Heritage Trail, the books we've written, the mobile applications we've created, I hope that people will learn to find the hidden history and appreciate its importance and diversity. There are so many fascinating people who played an important role in establishing the history of our area, and the people who live here should be very proud of that. And we really do have a treasure here that we can cherish for a long time.